Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Janet Rankin, Director of the Teaching and Learning Lab, and I'm very happy to welcome you to the Fresh Perspectives panel, which is our first event in our 2021-2022 Teaching and Learning Lab speaker series. And it's the first of two Fresh Perspectives panel presentations. There's one next week, and I'll get to that a little bit later. We're really happy you're here. In the spring of 2021, Ryan McDowell from TLL and Kate Weishauer from OBC conducted a series of 13 interviews with MIT faculty and instructors about their remote teaching experiences during the past year. We wanted to learn more about their strategies and their goals for student learning in particular, what they learned and what they were hoping to carry forward into future semesters. We know that teaching and learning during this past year and a half, or however long it's been, has been incredibly difficult and painful at times. And we want to acknowledge that while still appreciating these fresh perspectives that were afforded and required by teaching through the pandemic. We'll be publishing the videos from the 13 interviews on the TLL website throughout the fall, so you should look for them. And we're also interested in hearing and documenting more stories from the MIT community. So please contact us if you have a story to tell, or if you have a colleague whose story you think should be told. Today, we're really happy to bring together 4 of the interviewees. We have Luis Perez-Breva, Maria Khotimsky, Arthur Bahr, and Jen French. And these folks, if you know them, come from a wide swath of the MIT teaching community. Professors, lecturers, directors, and it's really an honor to have them all here. They've done amazing things. In addition to the panelists, I'd like to introduce you to Marcia Dunn, who is a graphic facilitator who will be visually capturing in real time the ideas and the discussions today. So we'll spotlight Marcia's work during the breaks in the presentations, during the Q&A. Feel free to pin her video for yourself, her video window for yourself, so that you can keep up on what she's doing during the panel discussions. I've participated in events that Marcia's facilitated, and her work adds a new and important dimension to the fabric of the discussions. And we'll have her completed work on the TLL website after the panels. In terms of structure, the panelists will each share their reflections to the 3 discussion prompts, which Ryan will show us now. I hope. Yes. What was your innovation during the pandemic or remote teaching? What teaching goal did it address? And what worked well or not so well when you implemented your changes last year? So that's the first part. They'll each speak in turn on that, and then we'll break and have some questions. If you have questions that you want to post in the chat during the presentation, feel free. We'll queue them up and try to address them either in situ in the chat or during the discussion. After we answer the questions to the first 3, hear the responses to the first 3 questions, then we'll come back and we'll hear the responses to sort of the looking forward, how's it going now, looking forward part of the presentations. Finally, if you're interested in hearing directly from more MIT faculty and instructors who have implemented new things, innovations, old things done differently, please consider attending next week's panel presentation. That's next Tuesday at 1 o'clock, and you can sign up there. And that will be Michael Short, Bruno Verdini, Dimitra Kopoulou, and Ray Alavi will be joining us for that. So I'd like to turn over the presentation to the panelists, and we'll start with Luis.
Great. Thank you, Janet, Ryan, and the team for putting this together and letting us share all the things we tried. So there is 3 questions, and my job now is to tell you my quick answers to those 3 questions. So I'll try to be as brief as possible. The first one is, what was my innovation? So by the time this is all done, I'll be remembered for one thing, which is they can hold a forest in my hand and turn it into my slides here, and I can point to my slides in person. So this is the one thing I'll be remembered for when it comes to the end of the pandemic. And this is not really an innovation, at least not to me. What was really interesting is all the things I had to change, which was fundamentally absolutely everything. And so to me, the biggest challenge, and I'm super happy to tell you more about details about this, was that I teach a class in which we tell students how to innovate with what they had. And so the pandemic forced me to go exactly to do that. So maybe I could have discovered my entire content was wrong. I guess it worked out. So slowly I started with a camera, and then I have a fancy setup, and I have all kinds of things going, like I'm talking through this device now, but everything I owned before, I just assembled it together and slowly grew the setup as the semester went. So this is the technology part, where effectively I learned that even though my laptop can do everything, it does everything very poorly. And so I need to kind of get extra equipment to do things, for instance, and I'll tell you the one example, and I'll switch to the next second question with that, is the first day I presented on Zoom, my students disappeared. I had 49 students. I was incredibly nervous. I had memorized my lecture. I had done everything that you do the first time you ever teach, right? And it's been 20 years, so I should not be doing that. And then I shared my screen, and then all I could see was Catalina Island, and I was terrified. The feeling, my brain went on a somersault. So that day I said, this will never happen to me again. I will not share screen on Zoom ever again in my life. And that, many iterations later got us to me being able to point to my slides. But it's more of a sequence of tiny fixes, more than me. There's a question there that you had, which is, what teaching needs did all these innovations address, and what went well and what didn't go so well? So for me, it started like nothing worked, and we slowly made everything work as the semester went. So the assignments were off, the student interactions were off. We didn't know how to make teamwork online. We figured it out. So slowly it was an enormous learning path all the way through mid-semester when I finally felt confident. I don't know if you guys remember the fall of 2020. The other big problem we had was that there was let's just say a high stakes election. I'm not going and lots of anxiety circulating around. And so that meant that I had to become a teacher and a counselor and a friend and a buddy. But this also taught me one of the things I have in my takeaways, which is that my job is not to just regurgitate content, which if you listen to EdTech pitches for a long time, they will tell you that the only important thing is the content. No, I am the instrument by which people learn, right? In a way, it's me who actually creates the whole interaction. It's the interaction that the students create. So I'm happy to talk more about that. The last thing I'll say is, how is it going this semester? So I'll tell you one thing I discovered in the pandemic. I discovered that finally the reason why we had a problem before the pandemic. So I don't know if you guys noticed this, but before the pandemic, we had an attendance problem. And it started to manifest in my class, where we'd look at the data in 2016, and I had no clue what it was. I just saw that half the way through the semester, students would start to not attend. And it was like a switch. They mostly attended all lectures, and 30% of the lectures they were missing. So I looked around, I asked, and it turns out it was, it's a really high investment. Given everything that's going on the MIT campus and all the networking opportunities, going to one lecture is an enormous investment of their time. And so what I learned is that we can structure the class very differently, make in-person super high value interactions, and we build in a hybrid mode towards that throughout the week at a time in which we don't stand in the way of them interacting with one another, which is what they seem to want to do when they're in person. So we're putting that to test this year. It's a hard year because we're neither in nor out, but happy to tell you more about that also. And I think I need to stop because I spoke for far too long. So next.
Thank you, Luis. So next up is Maria Khotimsky from Russia.
Thank you very much, Janet and Ryan, for organizing, and thank you everyone for being here. I teach language and literature classes, so I thought I would preempt my share by describing the subjects I teach. So my classrooms are range between 10 to 20 students, so it's a smaller subject, but it's very highly communication based. So the biggest innovations that I implemented last year during the pandemic were geared towards creating and maintaining the sense of the community while we are in the digital mode. And I will describe two things that I did to address it. One, I gave extra time and care to designing the Canvas site and paid special attention to the introductory orientation module, which included a concise class overview, both as a welcome video touring the Canvas site, telling students where to find what, and also sharing a personal message, telling them who I am, what I teach, and why I'm excited to work with them, what I look forward to in the semester. In addition, a new thing that I added was kind of more metacognitive mapping of the whole class and learning semester. In the past, our syllabi would include requirements, description of the main tasks, but I really conceptualized it and gave the students an idea why they're doing each specific task or each specific project, which language learning goals it fosters, how it feeds into their communicative and presentational competence, and what cultural discoveries they will be making in this class. So kind of carrying forward that excitement for learning and being way more explicit about it, I think helped very much last semester. And in terms of creating community connections, I have not used video discussions in the past. And during the pandemic, I started using the tool called Flipgrid, which is now available for MIT. It's integrated with Canvas, and I'm very thankful for that. It's much easier to use it now. And with Flipgrids, likewise, I encouraged each student to record a quick introduction even before the classes began. So those who pre-registered could already start meeting each other virtually. And then, of course, during the first day of classes, I sent a similar message encouraging everyone to participate. And so this video forum where everyone shares and can respond to each other has gone a long way. And I've used it both with literature and with language classes, where students can share something, ask a question, and their classmates respond. And overall, it worked well. I needed to make some adjustments, for example, for students with difficulty of accessing video bandwidth or students who were extremely camera shy. I realized that as we were doing it, so I added a provision that if you have one of those obstacles, you're very welcome to record an audio and put a picture of your choice that allows you to express yourself. So every voice is heard, everyone listens to each other, but in case if you cannot do the video presentation, you're not obliged to. And I think these are my main takeaways. I think we'll do the reflection on how it's going this year later on. So I'll stop there and I'll be happy to answer your question about both of those.
Great, thank you, Maria. And next up, we have Professor Arthur Bahr. Arthur?
Great, thanks. I slightly misconstrued the instructions, so my takeaways are much more general rather than responses to the three discussion questions. But basically, I was interested in trying to find ways of continuing the conversation between class sessions. So right in a traditional discussion class, like Maria, and a lot of what Maria said, since we teach similar kinds of classes, applies to my classes as well. But in a traditional discussion class, right, you have your 80 minutes and then everybody goes away, and then you have 80 more minutes later in the week, and then everybody goes away for even longer. And so those discussions kind of have the potential to atrophy in the interim. And so I started doing these little kind of short video footnotes to classes. Not every class, because people's time is valuable, but just if there was something that an interesting point that I had that the conversation didn't sort of naturally move to, or a response to a particularly provocative or insightful comment made by a student. And those video footnotes sort of act as continuations of the discussion. And then I also started doing little, again, only where appropriate, little sort of 3 to 5 minute kind of micro lectures about, say, the ecclesiastical prohibition on chivalric tournaments during the time of the Crusades, right? Some relatively narrow piece of historical context that you can't assume that students would have, and that might not emerge organically during a discussion, but that is nevertheless useful. So that's really what I started during the pandemic, and also a little bit of more targeted teaching of Middle English, the language for Chaucer specifically. But that's sort of into the weeds. So I think those are the general pieces. And then just to refer to these takeaways very briefly, well, I think they speak for themselves, and I guess we can maybe discuss more in the Q&A, but I'm going to try to keep it quite brief so there's lots of time for discussion. Thanks.
Great, thanks so much, Arthur. And then last but not least, Jen French from the math department. Jen?
I'm a digital learning scientist and lecturer, and one of the things that I do in the math department generally is help support some of our larger lecture classes in using digital content, in particular the MITx platform, to support student learning. And so when the pandemic hit, I was sort of naturally placed in a role, and I run a bunch of online courses as well on the edX platform. So I helped support a lot of faculty, in particular those that were running really large lecture classes. And in math, one of the big struggles was that our courses tend to grade very heavily based on in-person high stakes exams, which seemed not necessarily adequate as a measure of learning when you have completely flipped to an online setting. So one of the things that changed was that there was a lot more emphasis on different types of participation and different types of assignments and different ways of assessing learning, more like frequent quizzes as well as deeper homeworks, actually giving participation credit for posting questions on forums, for asking questions on Zoom, for answering somebody's question, and all of these sort of little pieces of building a community and creating these conversations that really were never assessed in any formal way before. And the way that this happened in a huge part was because we had access to a large number of undergraduate TAs, which were really essential because none of this was really automated. It really came from undergraduate TAs helping to track, graduate students helping to track all of this and keep track of who would get what. The other thing that changed was that we had a lot of digital content. So a lot of these courses went into sort of more of a flipped mode. But then they were like, if you decided to hold an asynchronous course, you still had to have a live synchronous component, which meant that now the faculty were meeting with sort of hundreds of students at one time, and then trying to create these really active problem-solving sessions, essentially also sort of reinventing recitation online, but with way more students. And the thing that was actually pretty powerful was that they were so well attended, actually, and that students were really engaged in asking questions. And I think a big part of that was that they were much less shy to participate and ask questions through the chat in the Zoom than to stop and ask a question vocally, you know, in front of everyone. And so there really was a really positive use of the chat to get people who would never ask a question normally would all of a sudden ask questions, and then have, but of course this also was facilitated by undergraduate TAs who would basically monitor this, answer questions, and then also stop the professor and be like, oh, actually there's a lot of questions about this, and sort of help redirect what was happening. Sort of in byproduct of this were that there were some courses that were sort of so well constructed and really well designed, and that students stopped attending their recitations at all, because recitations sort of became more like office hours. And so then students would just go to whatever office hour fit into their schedule better than necessarily attend their recitations. But it was almost by design. So it was sort of not completely unexpected. But you know, as Luis mentioned, you know, going to class is really hard. Also, going to an office hour is really hard. And so I really think that having online Zoom office hours has been incredible for increasing attendance and getting more students to come. I think, if you have one question about one problem, you might not find the trek across campus to your professor's office or to your TA's office to seem worth it. But if all you have to do is pop into a Zoom session, then you might actually stay and realize that there's some other interesting things that you have to hear about, or you might be able to help somebody else answer a question. And it became a much richer experience, which I think we're continuing. The one thing that I did not have on this takeaway slide, because it was not my innovation, but I do want to just mention how important it was for the math department, was that Drew Sutherland created something called the PSET partners. So math is also very PSET heavy, and these are supposed to be things that students do collaboratively. And so we're really concerned about how do we actually get students to meet each other and to work together when they're not having those spontaneous interactions in their dorms, in the hallways, like in their recitation sections. And so Drew created something called PSET Partners, where students basically could enter all the math classes that they were in, what their schedule was like, when they preferred to work, how they preferred to work, but also I think used some sort of sophisticated algorithms to try to sort of mix people a little bit in ways that maybe they wouldn't necessarily be mixed, to help create these connections so that students could work together. And we're also keeping this.
Fabulous. Thank you, Jen. And thanks, everyone. I think, well, folks, I haven't seen too many questions in the chat, so hopefully folks are saving those questions. I have a few comments and questions myself, but we're going to switch over to Marcia's visual notes at this point and just let everybody take a little look at them and see where we are. So I see one hand raised. Krishna, you want to ask the first question? And
Well,
we'll
just
leave this
because
up, I think, while we're.
I'll ask a question, because just to start things off, Janet, so that and it's prompted actually by what Arthur put in the chat, and pun intended. So Arthur wrote in the chat, the pros and cons of, quote, the chat, unquote, would be an interesting topic. And so I'd like to ask Jen about right now in the math department. So what you said about the chat having been quite valuable in the context you described, where students are more willing to ask questions by typing in the chat, and as long as they're undergrad TAs doing what you said, we've heard that from many directions. But the thing is, what about now when lecture is in person again? When lecture was synchronous by Zoom, you had to be looking at your device because you were looking at your device But now there's a trade-off. If a professor implements chat during a live lecture, an in-person lecture, then you've all of a sudden legitimized the students looking at devices like this in class, because they could be in the chat, but of course they could also be texting their friends. So are math faculty trying to recreate chat during in-person classes, or is chat during lecture a thing of the Zoom past? Right
now, I think it is kind of the past. I think that there's a little bit of PTSD from last year and just wanting a total return to normalcy right now. And but I do think that it's an interesting question, like how can we leverage communication tools that sort of could be distracting in a way that could still actually enhance participation. I think the things that are staying are asking more concept questions, doing more multiple choice so that you hear more voices, doing more frequent quizzing and things like that, which sort of give you a slice of that temperature of the room. But I don't know of anyone in the large lecture classes who's using the chat during live lecture.
Right, because what last year's experience showed is that there is real value of a sort of a curated back channel. So a back channel in which there are TAs, and the TAs can answer questions, the students can answer questions, each other's questions, and the TAs can stop the lecture. but how to actually do that in a way that's not a distraction and not sort of legitimizing, bad uses of your phone. I'm curious whether anyone is trying. And actually, I was riffing off of what Arthur put in the chat. So maybe Arthur should either ask or answer.
I myself found the chat useful. I was last fall, my Canterbury Tales seminar had, I think, 10 students. And I found it useful. But it could also become borderline distracting because, right, somebody's responding after the fact to, as indeed I did, right, in the chat, which is why I was kind of putting it in scare quotes. So it creates this sort of, the chat creates this asynchrony and also a sort of inherent distraction. And that distraction can be valuable or productive or whatever, but it is nevertheless different. And I was interested because my colleagues in literature had very different opinions about the chat. Some faculty turned it off entirely, and I found it useful. But yeah, I think it's I haven't missed it now that we're back in person, I will say. But then again, I'm teaching very different kinds of classes from the ones that Jen's describing. So
yeah, and I have heard from some that with the large classes, so not Arthur, your class, but with the large, I actually didn't hear this from math, but with the large classes, like the large math classes, that students are back to not asking questions when it's in person. That the ease of asking questions in the chat has not carried over. Rhea has a question, and Janet, I'll pass it back to you, but just to say Rhea has a question.
Yep, I see Ray's question. He also had a comment in the chat. So Rhea, do you want to jump in? And then I'm going to loop back to some of these chat issues. And then we also have a post from, I lost my posts here about some 901 using Slido. So let's hear from Rhea, then Laura, and then if it hasn't been brought up, I'll jump in. Rhea.
Sure. Thank you so much, Janet, and to all the presenters. I have a lot of questions, but this just popped into my head because it's relevant to what I'm doing right now. I was teaching a class last year, remotely, of course, and I'll actually be talking about that next week. I'm teaching the same class this semester on campus. It's a very different experience, as you might imagine. And one big change that I've noticed was that this semester, every lesson, at least a couple of students stay after the lesson to ask me follow-up questions that have nothing to do with their specific assignments. They're just expressing interest and asking follow-up questions and how they can learn more or apply more of what it is that I'm teaching them. That barely happened last year when I was teaching on Zoom, and then they were working mostly in teams outside of the lesson. So submission rate was good and everything went pretty well, but I didn't see much interest beyond the course material. So my question is there a way to encourage that sort of interest and those sort of questions when teaching remotely?
I had good luck, for what it's worth, just staying on Zoom for the 5 minutes after class, just making sure that I was the last person to log off of Zoom. And pretty often, one or more people would, it actually felt pretty comparable to the number of times that someone would stay after class in person. I would, often have someone stay after class on Zoom, and we just sort of go through them. The awkwardness, of course, is that whereas in person, you can have, one person can wait, if there are like, say, 3 students who want to talk to you, 2 can wait sort of discreetly off to the side while the one person asks, and there's a more private, that's not possible on Zoom. So that's a sort of technological limitation. But I think it's just staying after class. And I found it in committee meetings too. Like when I was chairing committee meetings, people would stay. So that's one thing to possibly try.
Yeah, I tried that and it was successful twice, but I think maybe because I had a very large number of students, maybe that was part of the difficulty, but thank you.
So if I may add to what Arthur was saying, I also had a great engagement after class, but I had also more students than ever on Zoom, actually, or not more than ever, but certainly on the higher range. and not everybody would want to stay. But one of the things I did early in the semester, building off the chat experience actually, was, I just gave them my cell phone and I said, just text me and we'll find a time. So we'll continue to chat beyond class. So I said, just use WhatsApp or Signal and just text me the your questions or the Slack channel. I mean, we already have all those elements there. Because I found that many would want to ask more questions, but the deeper questions sometimes take a while to be formulated. And after a while of flatness, you might need to kind of stretch your legs for the idea to pop up, right? In class, at least they walk to you, so at least they have those steps. In Zoom, they may have that. So what I discovered is that a lot of students would send me texts, again, at the end of their Zoom day with questions that I might be able to address via Slack channel or whatnot, or I might actually just set up a meeting to kind of address them in person, or my favorite is at the start of the next meeting, when I actually bring up the question for everyone to benefit for it, though you can manage this in different ways.
With an alternative channel, which was instant messaging for them to communicate with you.
Yeah, exactly. But by the way, it's the same thing that one of the things that's hardest in the digital versus non-digital world is to figure out what the exact analog is, right? So staying behind at the end of class for a deep question, the proper analog may not actually be to stay in the Zoom session, right? Because of the privacy things that Arthur mentioned and all those things. Maybe the closest analog is to have an open channel, the same way you might have been able to have office hours or essentially an open door policy, right? So I found that was the easiest analog for me, and it certainly improved enormously communication. And when the semester got really dire in the anxiety around October, November, it had helped a lot because the communication channel was actually open. I'm actually finding the precise opposite problem right now, which is that I went to class and I was missing the chat. I have many windows. I have one window for the chat. I have one window for participants, so I can see everything. And I was there with just people and only one screen. And I said, oh my God, what am I doing now? Where is all the rest of my information, right? But I also found the students with the mask and everything on were having difficulty interacting. Don't forget, it's not just that we're missing the chat, it's that we have a mask, right? And that kind of, so what I've actually done this semester, I don't think these semesters are going back because I never taught with a mask or to mask people before, so I don't know what this semester is. But what I found to be really useful is to go outdoors as often as I can. So we've actually only taught one class indoors because I find it to be completely preposterous. I mean, I feel like I went back to 1990s all of a sudden, right? I just don't know what the future beholds yet, but I feel that that's not the future anymore, right? So I'm trying to refigure this out this semester. And outdoors interaction stays the same way as you would have expected otherwise.
Thank you so much.
Thanks. Maria, I see your hand up. Is it?
Yeah, just to add to the many excellent suggestions for alternative communication channels. I feel like one office hour a week seldom works and everyone's busy at the time. So this semester I'm trying, and one of those many organizers that you can sign up for, and I have 10 or 15 meeting increments. And I find that students are more likely to sign up for a quick meeting and come and talk to you. When they know it's a quick appointment, they're going to pop in on Zoom, you'll chat, you'll answer their questions, be it logistical about their concentration, or be it more kind of philosophical, how to learn this vocabulary and not be swamped by it. But so having that, and I was inspired by our technical administrator, Joseph Barkowski, our instructional technologist, who has a similar tool for us to book meetings with him. So I open up several chunks of time on my schedule and split them into short increments. And I've had some success with signups for those. Thank you.
Thank you.
Great, thank you. And Arthur, your hand is still up. Is it a new hand?
Sorry, no.
Or an old hand? Okay, so yeah, I just wanted to jump in with a couple thoughts. One is that, it's really interesting to, I think when we all started on Zoom, it was how do we substitute? What's the substitute for what we did in person? And so we tried that, but as the semester, progressed, I think we all, certainly you all got more creative and more thoughtful about what it was you were doing, and have identified these things that were really quite effective and not mere substitutions, right? It didn't, we didn't really need a substitution. We needed another approach, kind of. And so now that we're back, I think there's sort of it's like a spiral, not a circle. And I think now that we're back, it's this idea of, okay, we learned the affordances of having a chat. And now we're back in person, so the conditions are different. The sort of the environment is different, so we don't really need the chat, and the chat won't work. But what about the way we teach? What about the way we hold our classes is sort of capturing the same thing that a chat would have? And I think in classes like Arthur's that are more discussion based, that are dependent on students having read the material before they come to class, and those kinds of things, the instructor's in the position of kind of really doing these micro check-ins with students as the class progresses. And so maybe the chat is less, maybe the idea of a chat is less necessary because they're being kind of pinged and they're having the opportunity to ping throughout the class verbally. But in other classes that are larger, it seems like maybe we still do need this affordance that the chat that we learned from the pandemic, but we need a way to do it in real time without increasing the cognitive load, without increasing distractions. So I find it to be a very interesting sort of like a ping pong game in terms of, well, we're not just trying to go straight back, we're actually trying to go to a slightly different place informed by what we learned. And I think it's just very interesting. So this is kind of a lead into the next part, which is sort of the final question, which is, how's it going now, which we have touched on a bit. And thank you all for sharing the things that you're doing now in response to what you did before, in response to the new conditions. And then also, like, what are the risks? How are you going to change these things kind of as you move forward, learning what you've learned about this kind of reapplication, this iterative application process? So we can go in order, or anybody that's feeling particularly moved could jump in if we want to do it that way. That might be a more productive way to go. Arthur?
Yeah, I think I just wanted to echo something Jen said in the chat about forgetting how to interact in person. I've felt that quite acutely, how challenging leading in-person small group discussions has been this semester so far, and I've been doing it for many, many years. So, but I feel those muscle atrophy a bit, you know, in the time away from the metaphorical gym, and my students have as well. And so we're all kind of getting limbered up, loosened up, and so I've just been trying to be very frank and upfront about the fact that we're all getting back into practice, and that includes me, and I think that's something that's really important, that I feel really passionately committed to, because I think it's I worry that it will all become all too easy for us to become boxes in a screen, because it is so much more convenient, and it is so much more convenient. And I think Zoom office hours, all of that is helpful, and those are good innovations that should stay with us. But I think it's so important to force ourselves and our students to remember how to interact in person as well.
Mm-hmm.
So I can give my try, Janet, if you want, to the answer of how's it going now and how do I envision carrying these insights forward. So I want to tell the registrar to change me to a hybrid forever in the following way. I want to ask them to give me a lecture slot after 5, or before 8, I don't care, a 1 or 2 hour for the lecture of the week. And then I want a 3-hour slot on campus, preferably outdoors forever, actually, because I'm really loving it. So my class, there is some lecture component. There's a lot of teamwork, and there's a lot of discussion that I require, and I've specialized over the years to have a lot of discussion, to the point that I spend the entire hour asking strange pointed questions. My students at first hate me, then love me for that, and what I learned to do last year that I'm going to carry forward is I changed the structure of the syllabus. Instead of being a lecture by lecture, which felt completely pointless last year. Seriously, it's like every day seemed the same. So it's like, why do you even organize yourself by day? So instead I went by weeks, right? And I created a cadence that was sort of there, but it had never been so formal as it was last year. which we would kind of start with the lecture component. We would slowly gravitate towards the practical component, all the way down to just talking about their projects together, right? It has always been there, but because I made it so formal and so clearly orchestrated, and I created a module per week, then I realized, why haven't I been doing this forever? So now I'm doing it that way exactly. And I even told the students, we tried a few times in person for the lecture, but it felt so less engaging because it was like looking into a bunch of people without a mouth. Facial expressions were gone. Questions were nowhere to be found. People would start dozing off, of course. I mean, you know, maybe it's the accent at first you think, but maybe it's just that they're bored behind their masks. So, and then we started to kind of do the hybrid component. And I said, you know, if there is enough votes, I'll go back to in person with masks. I also have a 9-year-old, so I'm not removing my mask. I'm sorry, I told them. But and somehow people have actually decided to kind of, after the first shock for the moment, they've actually stayed, and more people have come to the class because they see that we're still trying to do the same thing we did last year. So rather than pretending that everything is back to normal, we've accepted that we have yet another intermediate position, right? Intermediate state, and we're trying our best given what we have today. But then the last thing I'll add is that the teaching outdoors. So as Eric was asking a question in the chat, seating has been the greatest question of the great outdoors at MIT, because we have tents, but we have no tables or chairs, and I'm supposed to pay for them, but I am in a personal fight against the Institute, which I don't think the Institute knows I am in that personal fight, by the way, but about someone else should be paying for those tables. So so instead we found all kinds of creative ways. The first day was on the ground. That, you know, students are, I had to tell them that this is the way people used to teach before, but they didn't believe me. So then we found all kinds of tables that, if we found a set of setups where we can actually commandeer kind of tables outdoors, and close to one of the tents we have reserved. And that has created, at first they looked at me as if I was crazy, but slowly this has kind of taught them that there is better ways to do it than just kind of sit all of us in a classroom. And so they're incredibly engaged in those conversations, and they've gotten to kind of see this as a partnership, which I believe is still what we need to do this year and probably going forward always. Anyhow, that's my 2 cents on now and going forward.
Thank you, Luis. We don't have a lot of time left, so Jen or Maria, do you have any thoughts on this?
I can follow up quickly on what Luis said. We clearly are in the in-between territory, and I think the first day of classes, which I was looking forward to, was kind of like a cold shower, because I forgot how much we depend on smiling at each other and just like having that instant connection. So I almost had to tell, okay, we are smiling, like let's trust each other, and we are smiling, we are engaged, we are talking. So I think that's a big thing to work with this year. Who knows, maybe one more year. But to kind of to little plug for Flipgrid again, I realized that these video discussions, which I thought would be extraneous because we're already in the classroom, I'm actually enjoying them so much. And I think the students are enjoying them because they get to see each other's faces and smiles, and it is helping to create a bond. We haven't gone outside as much because we do need the slides for a lot of visual aid for discussion, but hopefully we'll conduct some classes outdoors as well. So thank you for that reminder, Luis.
Great. Jen?
I think right now it's a lot, there's sort of been like a strong attempt to return to the way that it was before. Like, at least in terms of assessments and things like that, exams are back. A lot of these like other more sort of human intensive ways of assessing are not as present, although except with the exception of the frequent quiz. I think there is more of an attempt at doing some like more frequent quizzing in the larger lecture courses, of course. But I do think that overall, faculty definitely saw the value of having more sort of Q&A and trying to make those interactions with students more robust. So I think like this semester in this in-between state, I think is maybe not going to be fully representative of where everything ends up.
Interesting. A little sad maybe, but maybe not, maybe not. I see a hand from Laura.
Yeah,
Laura
I just
Frawley?
I wanted to comment on two things. The first is I had mentioned in the chat that in 901, which has about 160 students enrolled in it, we use Slido for questions. So we used the chat function in Zoom last year when we were remote, but we didn't, obviously, we weren't able to use Zoom this semester. So we switched over to Slido so that we can aggregate and upvote questions as necessary, and we assign two TAs per lecture to monitor those, and then let either me or Mark, depending who's lecturing, kind of address any bigger questions. And so I forget who it was, but someone had asked about the overall distraction that this might lead for students if they have, access to their phones or laptops. And particularly in a class this large, people are on their laptops or phones anyway. And so my feeling is if people are going to be distracted, they're going to be distracted anyway, regardless of whether you allow them to ask questions remotely through their laptop or not, right? So I would rather personally allow people who might be a little bit more shy have the opportunity to ask questions and get their voices heard, and then have a couple people distracted than not give that opportunity. We also have a bunch of students who will come after class and speak to the lecturer one-on-one. So we've tried to combine as much as we can. And then on Jen's point about the assessments, we normally before had three exams and some quizzes, and that was their entire grade. And so we kept our grading scheme for the most part from the pandemic, which was we have 8 quizzes that are all take-home open notes, but they're more difficult questions that are select all that apply. They can use their notes, they can use previous recordings, handouts, etc. And they have 2 to 3 days to complete those quizzes. We also got rid of our final exam, and instead we have 5 questions that kind of spread across the 3 different parts of the course. We have 3 main parts, and we ask them to kind of integrate what they've learned and express to us, how they can bridge those 3 parts. That's it.
Thank you. I guess I was struck by the comments about kind of building connections, building community, and I think that's something that I think could really endure. Just I think it woke us up a little bit, maybe to say, gee, we have to really work at this. And so I think many of the things that you have all mentioned about how to make connections between students and between you and the students, I think are really interesting and really valuable and sound pedagogical activities. And so those are things that I find most kind of inspiring and most hopeful. And even something like the chat or the Slido is at some level, supporting that idea that everybody's question is welcomed, everybody's question will be answered. And I think that's really valuable. So that's my sort of, maybe not parting, I'm not sure it's my parting, but it's one of my thoughts based on your wonderful comments. I just want to point out that Marcia is sharing her screen at the moment if you choose to accept it. And so I don't know if it's big enough on your screen. Mine's a little tiny, but if you can take a look at that, feel free to take a look at that as you formulate any additional questions or comments. There's some comments in the chat about engagement, about working on laptops and phones during class. So I'm just gonna equal engagement in live classes versus now versus before the pandemic, masks, no masks, etc. Hopefully the masks won't stay, but we'll be back together in the classroom. Any comments, questions? This wonderful graphic note here. As I said, we will be posting it on our website as we as it becomes available, and we'll do it for this session, then also for the session next week. As I mentioned, we have another panel with another set of faculty and instructors. And that's next Tuesday at 1 o'clock. You can register through our website. The homepage has a link, tll@mit.edu. It's about 5 of. So we will hang around. Hopefully the presenters will be available for the next 5 minutes or so. So feel free to hang around and ask questions in the spirit of openness and supporting students with different preferences. We'll be here, but thank you all for coming. Thank the panelists. It's really wonderful to hear such, commitment, passion, and attention. And so we really appreciate it. So thank you very much.